let me just say a little bit of word about my own background and where I come from so you can place me in context. I work at an institute, the Institute for National Strategic Studies, which is a small think tank. In my component, we're only 20 people. And we work within the context of the National Defense University. It's not a public university, it's a university of the Department of Defense. And it includes a couple of faculties, the National War College and one or two others. And this is the highest level of professional military education in the United States. So most of the students are at the level of full colonel or Navy captain. We have some smaller courses in those faculties. But occasionally I will speak to who are generals and admirals. There's some senior civil servants as well, and there's international participation. There's almost always a British colonel or Navy captain, and I would say that roughly over the entire participation of maybe 500 or 600 in an annual class, there might be 15% who are international. And these are mixed seminars. The Americans don't go off in one room and the internationals in another. It's all mixed. Now, in our research component, we do three things. First of all, we've all been, well, there might be a few exceptions. Almost all of us have been either senior officials at the Pentagon. We have a couple with intelligence background, which I have before I went to work in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We always have a senior military representative from each of the military branches. And a couple with more, I would say, academic background, but who are really specialists in their field. And we do some internal work as an internal think tank for the Defense Department. We serve an interesting function as a networking function, where we can bring together in an environment under the Chatham House rule, military officers, senior military officers, and government officials, with academics, with non-government think tank experts. And this includes international visitors as well. I speak to a lot of delegations of European parliamentarians who come to Washington on visits, for example. And we do that in an environment where we can have a pretty frank exchange of views, but those visitors are comfortable because they know it won't be, in the Washington Post the next day. But then we also have a research, part of our research function is to do publications for the general public that are nonpartisan. We're not there simply to defend administration policies, and I'm not an administration official. I mean, regard me as just hopefully an informed expert. But to try to raise the level of national and international knowledge on defense-related matters. And I can leave behind some cards that have a website on it where you can access these publications. This is public information that's open to you. But the publications, in all modesty, are pretty well respected for their content and for their objectivity. Now, I've been at the Institute for about 10 years, but before then, I spent 17 years in the Pentagon. I had one overseas assignment, but I was a policy official dealing with arms control issues, mainly involving the Soviet Union and then later Russia. But my last position, which is more relevant to this topic today, is I was the director for NATO policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So I was directly involved in managing an office that was concerned about NATO capabilities, NATO's role in operations, NATO-Russia relations, the Partnership for Peace, and things like that. What I thought I could offer today is, and I will keep the remarks pretty brief, and then just throw it open to questions, is describe a little bit what's going on in the United States with regard to defense strategy globally. Because there's been a new strategy document that got a lot of press attention, some misinterpretation, I think, that came out in early January. You probably have seen headlines here about the U.S. tilt or pivot to Asia. And I'd like to describe a little bit what this actually involves. In fact, what the effects are of our presence in Europe, relations with Europe, and then say a few words about the NATO summit. NATO has periodic summits, as you know, and the next one will be in Chicago, May 20th and 21st. And some of those agenda items, I think, are probably particularly interesting for a British audience, but also I know that at least a few of you come from elsewhere in Europe, or in one case, Mongolia. On this overall question of, and I prefer actually the word that's actually used in the Defense Department document, which is not pivot, but called rebalancing. But this document, this guidance document, which is a public document, so you can look at it online, talks about the rebalancing of U.S. attention, broadly speaking, towards the Asia-Pacific region. The background is that 2 or 3 things are happening. One is, after a decade of warfare that the U.S. has been involved in Iraq and still in Afghanistan, the Iraq chapter, at least in terms of our military presence there, is closed. The troops have been withdrawn. In Afghanistan, as you know, there's still a very difficult struggle going on, at least in parts of the country. And I can say more about this when I come to the Chicago summit. But while it's still an ongoing conflict, and it's not a minor one by any means, there's still, as we speak today, there's still roughly 85,000 American troops in Afghanistan. There are over 30,000 Europeans, most of whom are members of NATO, and then there's some other international partners, to include Mongolia, to include Australia, and several others. But that is, it's not ended, and it's probably not going to end for a number of years yet. But this transition is underway to give more and more responsibility to the Afghans. At the same time, there are still some persistent threats from involving international terrorism. There is still a problem, perhaps an increasing problem, when you look at Iran and North Korea with regard to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. There are challenges, in some cases threats that people didn't talk about even 10 years ago, involving cybersecurity. And there are, particularly in the Asia-Pacific, other threats to the global commons, for example, the right to free navigation on the high seas. And in the background of all of this, we have a financial crisis. And it's interesting, and the President of the U.S. says this, the top military leaders agree as well, that deficits have become, in the United States, a national security issue. You never heard this type of language just a few years ago. And that, I wouldn't say that the strategy is simply driven by the budget concerns, but it's a factor there. Let me say I'll say 1 or 2 words about budget, then I'll talk more kind of geostrategic things. The United States, our military budget in real terms, basically doubled over the past 10 years because of the increase in spending related to Iraq and Afghanistan. In the past 2 or 3 years, there have actually been relatively modest but real decreases. So the curve is beginning to go down in real terms. Because of the deficit crisis and maybe a not so brilliant compromise reached with Congress, which was very divided over this, the administration today is committed to reduce spending over the next 10 years by nearly $500 billion. It's a tremendous sum. Still, the Defense Department, although the budget has gone down, or going down slightly, it's still a tremendous budget. It's still $525 billion for this coming year. This is the proposed budget. And Congress has to approve it, but it's going to end up more or less in this range, $525 billion, and that doesn't include a separate account for operations mainly in Afghanistan, which is another almost $90 billion. Tremendous amount of money. And everybody realizes this has to come down. This is imposing some cuts in operations or in material, some reorganization in the Pentagon. What's facing us is another big cut, perhaps as large as another $500 billion by the end of this year, or beginning at the end of this year, because of the way that this law was written. And those additional cuts will automatically go into effect unless Congress can agree to change the law. And since we have a very divided Congress these days, as you've probably been aware, we may have a financial train crash at the end of this year, which will also affect our defense spending. Still, even after all of that, even if all of these cuts come into shape, the United States defense budget will still be roughly equal to the cumulative sum of the next 10 defense budgets in the world. And many of those are US allies. We're still going to maintain very powerful military forces, but there will be a downsizing. So why the emphasis on Asia? It's not all about China, but it's in large part about China, but also North Korea. Many of the things, in some ways, this big shift, new emphasis to Asia Pacific, this has actually been going on for a number of years. Many of the relationships in terms of trade, expanded multilateral relationships of the US and Asia, some of the expanded military presence there and changing of the military presence in some countries began under the previous administration, under the Bush administration. Some of the things that are new to me that are particularly interesting are in the security area. I mentioned China. China is, we all know, a growing economic power. It is a growing military power. No one's seeking a military confrontation with China, but the China are building up forces, and they're beginning to use them in ways that some countries are a little bit concerned about. There have been a number of incidents involving the Chinese Navy and Vietnamese ships in the South China Sea. With the Philippines, in several confrontations. With Japan, and there's some other concerns raised by Singapore, by Indonesia, by Malaysia, all of those bordering states. Because that area, if you study it a little bit, is very rich in resources, both energy resources and fishing resources. And the Chinese are claiming a lot of that entire sea to be their territorial seas. So saying they have sovereign control over much of that area. So as I said, the U.S. is certainly not seeking a military confrontation, it's seeking on the economic and in other ways to have better cooperation with China. But there's both a concern on the part of the U.S. and a demand from countries in the region that we get more involved. Some of the things that are changing, we have not for a long time, basically since the early post-World War II, had forces based in Australia. Now Australia has requested a basing arrangement, a presence at least, and it's not enormous, but up to 2,500 or so Marines are going to be based in Australia. And there's a possibility of home porting, or at least regular visits by U.S. submarines to an Australian base. The Philippines, we had very rocky military relations with the Philippines for a number of years. Now the Philippines want to see at least a rotational presence of American forces. It may just be in the several hundreds, but it's more than just symbolism, and perhaps some other things. There's a home porting arrangement now for the very first time with Singapore. You're going to have 4 U.S. Navy ships home ported in Singapore. In Japan, There's an interest in increased cooperation both with the Japanese Air Force and Navy. Japan's a particular problem because where some of our forces were based on Okinawa, the local population would like to see those reduced. So there's some transfer going on. And there's some realignment still of our forces in Korea. We still have about 28,000 or so troops in Korea, and it's no secret that North Korea remains a very unpredictable and potentially, for the countries in the region, a very dangerous actor. We'll have to see. So there's this presence. It's interesting too that President Obama, when he was in Australia in November, commenting on the reductions in budgets and so forth, said that whatever happens, those won't affect our presence in Asia Pacific. So in a way, he was giving priority to that. And you can see that, and for those who are interested in the details, you can see that in the way money is going to be spent. The Army, our Army is going to be reduced by about 100,000, which is significant, about 15, almost 20% of the force over the next 5 years. The Air Force is going to have some reductions as well. The force that's not being reduced very much is the Navy. In particular, and I served on an aircraft carrier when I was in the Navy. We have 11 operational aircraft carriers, so not all at sea at one time, but it's a very powerful force. There was a lot of speculation of cost reasons and so forth that was going to be reduced to 10 or to 9. The decision has been, at least so far, no, we're going to keep 11 carriers. So when you begin to favor naval forces that much, that falls in line with this emphasis on the Asia Pacific. There's some possible risks in all of this. One is that by favoring Asia Pacific, there's always a risk that you're affecting too much your forces elsewhere. I'll come back to Europe in a second. There's always, if you don't react to the Chinese when they're more assertive, you might encourage those in Beijing who think that the U.S. just is in permanent decline to be a little bit irresponsible in their actions. On the other hand, if you overreact to them and if you give them the pretext of saying, oh, there's this military encirclement, you can actually provoke them to overreact in other ways. There's always a question that if the U.S. says today, well, this is our strategy, and then if we don't have the resources necessary and we don't carry it out, or if a new administration comes in and they change policy, which is always possible, then the U.S. loses credibility. So, and the Chinese, from what I know of them and what our experts have studied, is they look at the long game, not at the short game. What does all of this mean for Europe? There have been some reductions of U.S. forces in Europe, particularly Army forces will take place over the next couple of years. I would say don't be misled. These are not terribly dramatic. There used to be on paper, 4 brigade combat teams, which totals about 15,000 people altogether, a little bit more. And there's been a lot of attention to the fact that the U.S. said, oh, we're going to withdraw 2 of these. The fact is that for the past decade, 2 of the 4 brigade combat teams assigned to Europe, 2 of them have been either in Iraq or in Afghanistan. So it's not as if there's a big change really on the ground. And in some areas, for example, in missile defense, we're actually going to be putting more assets into Europe. There are going to be 4 missile defense ships imported in Spain. Eventually, in subsequent phases, there are going to be, there won't be a lot of personnel involved, but some. There will be missile interceptors under an arrangement with Romania and with Poland. And there are a few other instances where U.S. activity and presence in Europe will actually grow. So this is a mixed picture. Europe remains extremely important. It remains important because it's our only really major multilateral alliance. We've been committed, and I think we've done a good job overall since 1949 in terms of defense of Europe, And not just defending against attack, but also working with Europeans either on the periphery of Europe, for example, in the Balkans, or much further away, for example, in Afghanistan. And when problems arise in the world, there's a natural U.S. instinct, despite the fact that we don't always agree on all of the tactics, to look to Europe. And in order to do that, in order to work together, you have to train together, you have to have a lot of exchanges, you need some presence in Europe, both for defense, to reassure allies, but also to be able to operate together overseas. It's just the way it is. You can't do all of this stuff long distance and just by an occasional visit here. It brings me to the NATO summit, and I'll be pretty quick so I don't use up too much of the time for discussion. To be perfectly frank with you, it's not the only subject that counts, but the leading subject for Americans at NATO is going to be Afghanistan. At the last summit, there was general agreement that we're going to work towards a transition so that the Afghans are in the lead by the end of 2014. But really, we didn't get into the details of who does what at what time. There was a general discussion about a lasting commitment after 2014, but little discussion of the details. Now, some of the details are important to work out. How long and under what circumstances will countries stay in Afghanistan as part of NATO? Under what circumstances, what roles will they do? And are we going to agree as an alliance to gradually reduce and transition to the Afghans? Or are we going to end up where individual allies say, well, I'm done, I'm leaving, and do it at their own individual calendars, which would be unfortunate. The situation in Afghanistan, and I have not served in Afghanistan, but seeing a lot of people who have come back from there, and we have regular exchanges with senior military and civilians and so forth. It is a mixed picture, and we should be honest about that. And none of the U.S. military in private is really saying anything that's very different from what they're saying publicly. They're very consistent that this is not a struggle that can be won in classic military terms, despite some of the rhetoric that you might hear from some of the candidates. And it's a political season in the United States. But the administration and the military, you don't win the struggle like this. You want eventually to find some kind of negotiated solution. But you have to do this on the basis of at least an Afghan national security force that can provide reasonable protection and security for its people while you're trying through civilian agencies to try to develop the country a little bit better, make it a little bit more responsive to its own people, to the needs of its people. I know there are these high-profile attacks. But overall, the security picture has improved in many parts, not all, but in many parts of the country. Overall, the Afghan National Security Forces are bearing more of the burden of combat operations. And the picture is not brilliant, to use a British phrase, but overall it's not as desperate as you might get the impression from some of the headlines. There is some real progress, and there are more and more Afghans that are actually fighting for their own country, which is, this is important. There are a couple of big problems in all of this. That is that next door in Pakistan you still have a sanctuary for extremists of various stripes. Some are, it's actually kind of more like an organized criminal gang, but others are more religious or ideologically extremist. They also pose a serious threat to Pakistan as well as to Afghanistan. And the military can't think of any precedent where they've been relatively successful in the counterinsurgency in one country if there's a sanctuary in the neighboring country. And it's not the only other big problem, but there is a big problem with the lack of Afghan government capacity and the big problem with corruption in the country. And the military can't fix that. And our civilian authorities are having a difficult time dealing with that as well. So you can't ignore that, but there are efforts underway to try to limit it and over time improve the situation. So I'm not here to say that this is an easy task, but I just caution you to at least to think about the consequences of a premature just withdrawing from Afghanistan. What this would mean first and foremost for the Afghan people, but also for our own security. I don't think any of us have an interest in seeing another kind of ungoverned territory be used as a base for logistical planning, training support, and all of that for international attacks, which would affect your day-to-day security, as it already has in London and UK or other countries in Europe, and it certainly has in the United States. So I'm not predicting an endless war here, but we're going to have to be in Afghanistan, and probably will, in some measure, at least in training and support for a period of time. It also costs money, and how you're going to share the financial burden will be one of the subjects at Chicago. I'll just mention very briefly now two others. One is a theme of smart defense. When I was in the Pentagon, we called it a different name. We had Defense Capabilities Initiative. After I left the Pentagon, there was another summit, the Prague Summit, and there was a Prague Capabilities Initiative. There was another Capabilities Initiative at Lisbon in 2010, and now the bumper sticker is smart defense. All of these programs, they're a little bit different in the way they're structured and so forth, but the overall thrust is the same, and that is to try to improve multilateral cooperation, because particularly under the defense austerity that we're living in order to maintain or in some cases improve capabilities, you just have to cooperate. There's no alternative. The two problems here, for particularly I think for the political scientists in here, sovereignty is not dead. There are sovereignty issues here. There are countries, the UK is only one of them, that are concerned about putting too many of their eggs in one basket, in the NATO basket, and resources, and then finding out that when it comes to a crisis, there may be one or two allies that don't agree. And therefore, all of a sudden, the UK can't use those assets because they're NATO assets, and everything NATO does has to be agreed by consensus. There are ways of trying to finesse that, but those are serious issues. And then there's a serious issue of money. UK defense budget has gone down, not as drastically as some feared, but it's gone down significantly. This is true most of the other countries on the continent. But sometimes in order to save money in the long run, you have to spend more money in the short run. So if you're combining capabilities, combining facilities, those require some costs. And no one's in the mood to spend more. And in some countries where they still have important defense industries, and the UK is one of them, people naturally are concerned about where are the jobs going for our money. Does smart defense mean I'm going to pay for an industry or contractor in another European country? Then taxpayers here in the UK won't be so happy. The final thing I'll mention, there are some hot button issues where sometimes the rhetoric reminds me, unfortunately, of the Cold War, and that's on missile defense. When I hear Russian officials complain that NATO missile defense, somehow it's all about Russia, it's directed against Russia, we're trying to surround Russia, it simply is not true. And I believe, my personal opinion is that their technical experts understand very clearly that NATO missile defenses have no capability against their strategic forces. And yet they keep repeating this over and over again, and sometimes in threatening ways. There might even be preemptive attacks against European states that host NATO missile defense facilities. I think these are politically inspired. You can guess as to some of the reasons why it might be. Fortunately, not everything is bleak with Russia. If you had asked me a few years ago, could I envision that Russia would use or allow its territory and airspace to be used for NATO to transit equipment to a NATO operation in Afghanistan, I would have said, you're crazy. That's exactly what's happening today. In fact, it was increased after the last summit. And Russians privately, but also publicly, are urging NATO not to leave too quickly in Afghanistan, because if that area, becomes a greater hotbed for extremism, and if there's not something to control the flow of drugs, which is killing the youth in Russia, then their national security is at stake. When they see their own interest at stake, they get more interested in cooperation. Right now, in terms of missile defense, they think, for whatever reason, they can score some points with this, what I view as Cold War rhetoric, and I hope that will eventually change. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
I've gone over my self-assigned time limit here, but you'll pardon me.
No, that's fine. It's very interesting. Thanks very much. Questions?
What do you make of President Hollande? President-elect Hollande?
Oh, I think this has been, if you're interested, go to our website. I'll leave a card, because I just did a paper on that subject, and I did it before the election. So I presented, I think in an even-handed way, the two scenarios. I think on defense affairs, there's going to be a lot of continuity with the Sarkozy government. On nuclear matters, which is very important, nuclear weapons matters, I don't see any difference at all. Sarkozy is publicly pledged, and his advisors all say this as well, that France is going to maintain its deterrent, which is different from the British deterrent. They have not only submarines, they have air-delivered nuclear weapons as well. He said he was going to keep both components. He mentioned that there are savings to be had in defense. He was not specific. My guess is, and I've had French officials and experts tell me this, that even if Sarkozy had been re-elected, there were going to be cuts in defense. It just, as you go into austerity, you can't have only education and social things bear the brunt of reduction, so there would have been some cuts in defense. Hollande's advisors don't dispute that, but what they say is that they will be very careful, and at least they say they won't make defense cuts bear a greater burden than other cuts. That if they have to cut public spending by X amount, eventually that the defense will maintain the same, will be cut as well, but it'll maintain the same percentage of public spending right now. About 3% of total public spending in France is for defense. Where I see a couple differences possible, but time will tell. His calendar for the withdrawal from Afghanistan on the surface appears to be 1 year faster than Sarkozy. Sarkozy changed, by the way. He, without a lot of consultation, I think, accelerated the French calendar by a year in January, when they lost some soldiers due to an Afghan soldier killing some of their forces. So instead of 2014, he said, well, we're going to withdraw combat forces by 2013. Hollande said by the end of 2012. That's what he said. But privately, there are French military experts who say that that's simply impossible physically. Because
it's really possible they can't lift everybody out?
That's right. Well, it's not just the personnel. There's a lot of equipment, infrastructure, and so forth. And withdrawals can be very tricky. And I think the French will come under different types of pressure. Maybe pressure is too strong of a word. Hollande, as the new president, has an interest long-term in maintaining good relations, obviously, establishing and maintaining good relations with the U.S. He also has a very important interest in maintaining that with Britain, because he has said he would honor all of the new bilateral agreements with Britain, and also with other Europeans. Hollande has said he's going to give a new force to European defense. European defense assumes a sharing of burden. What's it going to look like to the other Europeans if France, the great champion of European defense, is the one to pull out of an operation unilaterally? So I would say, and you may not see much of a change between now and June because they have parliamentary elections. But I would say watch what they do and not just watch what they say. But bilaterally, we've had good relations with the French. In some areas as good as we have with the UK. We do have a kind of a special relationship with the UK. And most Americans are happy to see the increased bilateral cooperation between France and the UK, which I think, there may be a bit of a pause here or there, but I think it's inevitable that that's going to continue. So I'd look for more continuity than change, and I think that's a good thing.
I wanted to ask about deficits and budgets. In this age of economic turbulence, do you think that certain countries within NATO need to step up more? Those that say aren't feeling the squeeze as much, like Germany and Norway, for example, and kind of balance out the reductions in other countries? Or do you think it's okay that military forces do get smaller as we come to live in a world where more and more operations are carried out by special forces and are intelligence driven rather than being carried out by large standing armies?
Yeah, well there are a couple of things there. Actually, Norway is one of the few countries that's increasing